I'm back with Dr Mari Takayanagi here in the Acts Room at the Parliamentary Archives, where we're going to be discussing the 1918 Representation of the People Act. So in 1918, who did the Act actually extend the vote to?
The Representation of the People Act 1918 gave the vote to 12.9 million men and 8.4 million women. For men, this meant pretty much every adult male could vote, the only exception really being conscientious objectors who hadn't done war work, who were disenfranchised for 5 years. But for women, there were lots of restrictions. Most importantly, you had to be over the age of 30. So if you were younger than 30, you couldn't vote at all regardless. But even if you were older than 30, you still had to meet another qualification, a property qualification. You had to meet the qualification for the local government franchise, and in effect this meant you had to be the householder. You had to be the head woman of a household, not only over the age of 30, but you had to live in a dwelling house or occupy property to the value of £5 a year or more. And this meant that lots of women who had done essential war work did not get the vote because they were too young, or because they were maybe older than 30 but they lived with parents, they were domestic servants living in, and therefore they didn't meet the property qualification.
And why were women not enfranchised then on the same terms as men?
Women were not enfranchised on the same terms as men because it would have meant that women would have outnumbered men as voters, and that was not politically acceptable. So many men had been killed in the war, of course, and there was a lot of fear. Even amongst supporters of women's suffrage, there was a lot of uncertainty about what it meant, and the idea that you would create suddenly more female voters than male was just not acceptable. So they needed some sort of qualification, and the age and the property together they thought would mean they would get about 6 million women voters, but in fact it was in the end more than 8 million.
What was the extent of support for the Act?
The Act as a whole had a lot of support because it was necessary to get some electoral reform, as had been established by the Speakers' Conference on Electoral Reform. But it was by no means agreed in Parliament that women's suffrage should be part of that. That was still controversial even in 1917 when they started debating the Act.
Was its passage a foregone conclusion?
The clause on women's suffrage in the Representation of the People Act was definitely not a foregone conclusion. The reason for this being that it was a free vote, the government did not put the whips on, and therefore it was up to every MP to decide whether to vote for it or not. And although the war had done a lot to change opinions, attitudes and so on towards women, there were still diehards in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords who were prepared to argue to the last ditch to put down wrecking amendments and generally obstruct the passage as much as they possibly could. Now in the end the majorities were okay. In the House of Commons it passed 385 votes to 55, and in the House of Lords 134 votes to 71. But it was by no means assured that that would happen. So this is the House bill for what became the Representation of the People Act 1918. As you can see, it's quite a chunky document because it was a complicated act that affected a lot of things apart from the franchise. You can see the name on the front here, and then when we open it up, you can see it contains all the amendments, all the changes that were proposed and in some cases made while they were discussing the bill in both houses of Parliament. So today we copy and paste within a Word document, for example. In these days, they actually literally had to copy things out and paste them in, and in some cases literally sort of stick them in and fold them out like that. So you can see it was a very complicated act which had a lot of amendments suggested, a lot of crossings out, a lot of changes. This is clause 4 on the franchise to women, which contains the amendments they made over here.